always knew I was adopted, so I thought there was a possibility that somebody would be out there. I'm Larry Jenkins. I'm 75 years old. I grew up in the Asheville, North Carolina area out in Fairview. I was adopted at 3 months old, and I grew up as an only child. My parents had lost a child about 3 years before that. And I had grandparents and great-grandparents on both sides, had tons of cousins, grew up out in the country and did what country kids do, played in the creeks and worked on the farm and hiked, and at an early age, if I could get out in the woods, I was gone. I looked at the adoption papers in the early 70s, 72, 73, and I found a name, and that kind of satisfied me for a long time. I thought, Mom and Dad are getting older, and if I'm gonna find this person, I need to find her. So in 92, I started looking. Went to the courthouse, looked at birth certificates, found it under the name Jenkins, found it under her name. Then I looked at marriage license, and that's when I found out what county she was from. And then my wife went there and got some phone numbers. The first one we called was her sister-in-law. And my wife was calling to just try to get in touch with somebody she'd lost touch with. And that's when we found out that she lived in Asheville, North Carolina, just on the other side of the mountain from where I grew up. But her family went to the same high school I went to. After my wife talked to Mom's sister-in-law, my wife said, "Do you want to call?" And I said, "No, I want to meet her." So I go. She's not home the first time I go. The next time I go, she's coming out of the driveway. And at that time, I had birth certificates, marriage license, marriage certificate, and wedding announcement. All this information on her rolled up on the dash of my car. And I get out and say, "I'm Larry Jenkins from Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm looking for these two families that I went to high school with." So we're standing there in the driveway talking, and I'm just soaking this woman in. Hands, mouth, face, countenance, everything. Sweetest lady. And I'm just keeping her talking. And finally she said, "Well, if you're from Nashville, Tennessee, how do you know all these people?" And I said, "Well, I graduated from Reynolds in 64. She said, "I had her son graduate in 65. I said, "What's his name?" And she said, "Ronald Jackson." I go, "I knew him, you know." And then I just kind of dropped it at that. And I left. And 2-3 weeks later, I go back to Asheville. Can't find her at home. Knew her husband was sick. Called all the hospitals, wasn't there. Called all the funeral homes, wasn't there and hadn't been there. And I'm thinking nursing homes. And before cell phones, I go to Shoney's, get a cup of coffee and a handful of quarters. I was just going to start calling the ones close by. And I asked the guy, "Is there any nursing homes nearby?" And he said, "Brand new one right down the street." I didn't even call, just go down there, go in, find out her husband's there. And I wait in the hallway like the guy waiting on the girl to come down the hallway in school. And she comes out, and I said, "Well, we just keep running into each other." And she remembered me from talking to her. And since I was from there, she wasn't suspicious about why I was there, because she figured I knew somebody in the nursing home. So I asked her how her day was and how her husband was, and we walked down the hall, and she said, "Did you find those people you were looking for the other day?" I said, "I found everybody I was looking for. I got one more." I said, "You were so helpful. I got one more person I want to ask you about. And I started asking her some questions, and she reached out and got me by the arm and said, "Are you that baby?" I said, "I'm that baby. I'm not here to mess up your life. I just wanted to meet you." And she said, "I have prayed for this day." We started talking, and I told her, "I'm not trying to be a Jackson. I don't know the dynamics of your family. If we have a relationship, we'll have to develop it. It might be cards at Christmas and birthdays, or it might be more." Well, it absolutely turned into more. She came into our family. She came to her kid's wedding. She wanted to come hear Billy Graham in Nashville, and I brought her down for that. I asked her, "Are you going to tell your family?" And she was like, "No, I've got granddaughters that wouldn't understand." I said, "That's fine." I said, "So I won't tell my family, but we got to have a story." So I was her friend from Tennessee, and she was my friend. And she worked in church, and she worked at school, and she worked at the Cove at the time. So if you went out with her, good chance you was going to run into somebody that knew her, and occasionally would see somebody that knew me. And one day a guy looked at me and said, "Who are you?" And before I could say anything, she said, "He's a friend of mine from Tennessee." And he looked back at me and said, "Well, Catherine, he looks just like one of your boys." She said, "He is. I claim him." But that's all she said. She didn't, explain it. And so we went like that for 13 years. And she learned that she could trust me, that I wasn't going to say anything to anybody. But I did tell her I'd like to meet them or talk to them. One time we went out to eat, and she reached across the table and got me by both hands and said, "Let me look at you." And we just sat there and talked, and she held both hands, and I shared that with somebody, and they said, "That was Mom holding that baby the first time." 13 years later, after I met her, she started telling the family, tried to get them all together. That didn't work. Ron, the one I went to school with, was the first one she told. And she told him, "You can't talk to anybody else until I tell you who I've told." And Sister Kathy was the next one, because they were going down. He was going to have surgery. He lived in Florida, and they were going to go down and see him. And on the way, she told Kathy. And I said, "What'd she say?" And she answered the phone and said, "Hello, brother." I was like, wow. Now, when she told Ron, I waited about a week, and I called him and didn't get an answer. And then I went out of town, and that night my wife, I was talking to her, and she said, "I've been on the phone with your brother in Florida for 3 hours." She said, she told him, "Larry would like to meet you." And he said, "Meet me? I want to get to know him. He's my brother." I said, "He called me brother?" Every sibling, when they found out who I was and met me in person or on the phone and knew who I was, called me brother. That family took me in. I'm just one of them. I'm not another brother. I'm not a found brother. I'm not a step brother. In fact, Dale called one time, somebody passed away, and he said, "Do you want to go to the funeral?" And I said, "Well, they don't know who I am." And he said, "Well, you're just my brother. Period."
I'm Dale Jackson. Grew up in the Asheville, North Carolina area, and I'm 71 years old. Grew up with 3 brothers and a sister. I first met Larry, and I'd have to think about the years, but probably 20 years ago. Actually met him early. He was trying to locate us, and in respect for my mom, who wasn't quite ready to announce Larry's existence, he came and saw me at a racetrack in Tennessee. Met Larry, and he and I talked for an hour or so. I can just imagine he was wanting to say, "I'm your brother." And I can just, but out of the respect he had for my mom, or our mom, he did not share that part of the story. with me, but just a very, I remember him coming and being there, and most people don't spend an hour with you in a trailer during a cold weather, rain, whatever we were doing there, spend that time, but Larry did, so that was my first real meeting with him. Later on, Mom shared the story of Larry, and we were all a little, I would say shaken, a little wow. Once we got over that wow, okay, let's meet this brother. If he's alive, that's wonderful. Pulled a whole lot of things back together for me in terms of, that's the reason Mom did this. That's the reason we did this. That's the reason in July we had birthday cakes, but nobody had a birthday. Always enjoyed driving, just always something I wanted to do. I actually drove a NASCAR race car at Amboy Speedway in Asheville. First got into Land Rovers because I just saw them. Growing up in the Asheville area, every once in a while I'd see a series Land Rovers. Like, what is that? Where do you get those? And finally one day I said, I'm gonna follow this guy so I can ask him what it is and where do I get one? Because it just looked like something I would love to have.
I grew up with Jeeps, and I didn't have a four-wheel drive, and I'd been thinking about getting one. And then when I met Dale, he was into Land Rovers big time. And he took me around, showed me all of them the first time I met him, and I fell in love with them immediately. Dale and I were up in Kentucky I didn't get the maps for the Kentucky Adventure Trail, but we just go up there and ride around in the woods. Finally met a guy and he put us on the trail. And we come up on a tree across the trail, and we didn't want to turn around, and we just got on this trail. And we could have backed out, but it was real narrow. And the tree was in a bind, didn't have chainsaw, just had small tools. And I didn't want to cut it anyway because it was in a bind. And I said, we can go under it.
And big.
And it sounded better in my head than it turned out to be in real life. But Dale did find out how methodical and determined I am, because he was ready to give up a few times, and he'd go into the supervisor mode. I'd catch him watching, and I'm here to dig. And
4 hours later.
4 hours later, unload the roof rack, take the roof rack off, and dig under the tree. But we got under there, and then we immediately set up camp in the road. And
but it's also, we're not, it's just a funny memory now. I'm not tired from it. I'm not anything else, and probably wouldn't do anything different, because if we'd have just drove through there, I wouldn't have remembered that spot.
Fell on dark days, scared to lose. I cried for you. In your arms, Lord, carry me through. I won't go without you. Oh Lord, you're closer than a brother, a friend that I could fall on. God.